rate of security and crime.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. You get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I am with Elijah Emery, student at Cornell, recent guest on Sublation Media podcast on Christopher Lasch, and Elijah is doing academic work on Lasch, a burgeoning but often neglected field. It's actually interesting. Both the people who have talked to me on Lasch recently have been on the younger end of socialist in their early and mid-20s, and I find that both hopeful and worrying. Hopeful in the sense that, yay, Zoomers actually believe in something, and worrying in the sense that it indicates that we have not transcended certain problems of the late 60s and 70s, which predate even my life. So we were talking beforehand a little bit about our differences in interpretation of Christopher Lasch. You have admitted to being very influenced by me. You read him on your own, did the thing that people do, and got sucked into the podcast world. Funnily enough, Elijah, you'll get a kick out of this. How I got sucked into podcasts is actually very similar. I had been very frustrated before I was a high school teacher. I was asked to teach Althusser. And, you know, I got a graduate student lecture on Althusser. It was like 2 hours. And they're like, and go teach sophomores in college Lenin and philosophy. Have a nice day. And to try to be able to do that, I read a bunch of Badiou and a bunch of Zizek. But then I wanted to check my understanding of these figures. And I was no longer a student, but now an academic at that time working in Korea. And my philosophical background had come out of analytic philosophy on one hand, and a particularly conservative form of Hegelianism by one of my three right-wing mentors. I'll mention him by name. I don't usually go into my period as a right-winger very deeply, and it might come up more today because this individual is also the person who first had me read Christopher Lasch. His name is Dr. Daniel Fernald. He left academia probably around, almost a decade ago now. He's the person I've told the infamous anecdote about. He gave me Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky and told me that they used it to win the Reagan Revolution, and which is amusing to me because I think it's actually more useful for conservatives than leftists. And then he had me read Culture of Narcissism and Revolt of the Elites, and that was pretty much it, actually. He told me to look at Lasch as an answer to the nihilism of postmodernism. But so that's my background. So I'm sitting around, though, similar to you. I'm finishing up some academic work, actually comparing leftist subcultures to occult figures, which is a really ambitious and strange academic paper I was working on in South Korea that I later abandoned because it was insane. But I went looking for people to explain Althusser for me. I found Zizek doing it. That got me into two different podcasts that partly examine life and the original OG Diet Soap, which was coming out when you were probably 9 years old.
The good old days.
Mm-hmm. It was also I had been a Marxist. I was in academia. This was at a time when there was not a lot of Marxist in academia, and it was beginning to come back up due to the same chapter that's been literally in almost every book about Marxism. You start off now after 2007, and it's like the recession of 2007 has returned Marxism to its relevance. And like, that's a cliche now, but it really is kind of true that a lot of us came out of that moment. I was coming out of this very right-wing period of my life. I was lost for a bunch of years, and I kind of really felt close to Lasch the entire time, because in Lasch's late work, there is this description of the struggle, and I sort of went through the struggle he did. So I first from paleoconservatism moved to like vaguely leftist communitarianism, and I still have a soft spot for like Charles Taylor and Michael Sandel in my heart, right? Like it's still there. Where I was not particularly anti-queer. I was actually really pro, even as a conservative, the removal of sodomy laws and stuff like that. I was never into conservatism. But I really kind of believed at the time that there was a way to have a civic nationalism that could incorporate all these different groups, and that would be based off of local communities, blah, 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 blah. Then I sort of get pulled into a populist progressive direction that has me read things like Naomi Klein. I've talked to the story. I read Shock Doctrine, and it has the opposite effect on me. It turns me against Keynesianism forever. Like she's telling a story where it's like, well, we should give up on these ideological blah 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 and defend Keynesianism, and I'm like, you just showed me all these Keynesian and central and social democratic and even communist governments that were moderate, and how each one of them neoliberalized, and in many cases neoliberalized further and more thoroughly and more completely than their conservative counterparts. I don't understand, me. And so that book I actually attribute to accidentally making me a full-blown Marxist in 2008, 2009. And so that was my journey, and I felt like I was going, as I was reading Lasch, I felt like I was like going back through the stages he went through in the late 80s, where he's like, well, the left has obviously become something I don't recognize. It's not helpful to talk about it anymore. I'm going to flirt with communitarians. Oh, that doesn't work. I can't go, I'll try to go full Rendell Berry. I can't go there. I'm going to flirt with populist. Although I realize the problems with populists, and if you and I would talk about this is where there's a kind of a rupture in Lasch's work. But I think, to bring it to the point I was originally get to, besides all that biography, autobiography in this case, that one of the things that spoke to me about this is I do see that there's a continuity between late Lasch and early Lasch. There are two developments that kind of change it. One is fully embracing Freudianism, particularly the American British Freudianism, as opposed to like the more popular on the left French Latin American Freudianism. Fully embracing that as an answer to trying to figure out what was going on, as a kind of rejoinder to the abuses of Haven and a Heartless World. I mean, there's an interview that Lasch did right after True and Only Heaven came out, and right after I think Lasch knew he had cancer, where he talked about how he went to Freudianism after reading, the Frankfurt School and Norman O'Brown and all these other key figures, and reading a lot of American British Freudianism, to try to explain what he was seeing in response to Haven and a Heartless World in particular, and the feminist backlash against it, because he kind of didn't entirely understand why he was getting such a backlash. And in hindsight, there are things that he realizes at the end of Haven in a Heartless World that are hard to deny as empirical developments, such as the fact that girl boss, or I like to think of it as Kathy feminism, really coincides with the depression of wages. And it seems to have been a way to, almost an ideological coping with the fact that the family wage had collapsed, that the experience of upper middle class women have been normalized as the experience of feminism, and that have been sold as a justification to lower class women for a bunch of things that happen. And I actually think he's right about a lot of that. I don't think that he's necessarily later on completely fair to some of his feminist critics at all. But I will also say, having read feminist critics of him after his death, they are not fair to him either. I mean, I read something, and the Association of Cultural Historians, where someone just called him a concern troll, and I was like, no, I don't think we're reading the same person. Like, this is a man whose mother was a feminist, who spoke eloquently and explained the positions and developments of 19th century feminism really thoroughly. Knew the way that liberal feminism had subverted more radical forms of feminism, even in the 60s and most definitely by the 80s, and who had a lot to say about patriarchy's effect on women, even though it's not something that's often picked up on in his work. It is something he talks about. His answers to it, I don't think, are viable. Like, he believes, for example, that the way to make companionate marriage work would be like more social prohibitions on men, which I just find to be unlikely to work. There were stances he took that he was actually in line with feminists of the time. I'll give you an example of this. Both Lasch and WHO, the Women's Association, oppose no-fault divorces. Now, objectively, I think that was a bad idea. I was pointing out on Twitter yesterday, and this will be released far later, so we're speaking in late August of 2022, that murders of women had declined rapidly, and by far, like 77% of all murders are men killing men, usually of the same race as them, usually someone they know. And then once you get that, it's romantic partners killing women, are being killed by cops. Those are pretty common. And then the most common thing is suicide, although that's not murder, so it's in a different stat set. And I was just pointing out that no-fault divorce has not been proven to be causal, but it's strongly correlated with the decline in murders of women. And so there are things where I disagree with Lasch's policy. But the one thing I will give Lasch, and one of the things he generally didn't do, and I think Chris Lehman talked about this in his interview on Know Your Enemy, and I've also gotten this from Kevin Mateson and from some work I've seen out of New York on, I think Lasch's wife says also, you should be careful trying to deduce policy prescriptions from Christopher Lasch, because he generally did not feel it was his place to do that as a cultural historian and as a public intellectual. And furthermore, it'd also be, frankly, the kind of thing he critiques in Culture of Narcissism, because he would then be acting as a kind of expert that he thinks has largely subverted human community. But all this is a long-winded way to say that you and I are both interested in the same thing, and you kind of fell into it in the same way I kind of fell into podcasting in a different reasons, because I was looking for people who were articulating things that I was having to teach in simpler ways. So I was trying to figure out a way to explain it to undergrads, and that began this long journey, which ended very quickly with me leaving academia, going back to teaching high school, and then becoming a podcaster on the side, initially as a hobby, because until 2017 you generally just lost money as a podcaster. So here you are as a person who was writing on Christopher Lasch and was looking for someone to explain these things in a cogent way. So the other thing you pointed out to me, though, is you think I focus a lot on the differences between Lasch's early and late work. Shal and I have come up with a periodization. It was a 3-part. It's now a 4-part periodization. I'm going to run it by you. This is the second time we talked about it, period. And this will be one of the essays in the book that Shal and I are writing on Lasch, where I have Lasch as a cultural historian of the left. That is from Liberals in the Russian Revolution, his dissertation, up through World of Nations. I consider those one set of books. Kind of, if you look at the essays, they're very depthfully actually edited together, but they also speak to each other between the books.
Yeah, I mean, this is one thing where you can see how the new radicalism in America is a real outgrowth of the ideas talked about in American liberals in the Russian Revolution, and then in turn how Agony of the American Left and World of Nations address. Agony of the American Left addresses sort of, in my mind, some of the mainstream of the left, and World of Nations addresses some of like the side optics of the left, with the addendum of the essays on McGovernism, which are obviously much more central to history than, say, the Mormons were.
Yes,
but sorry for continue your.
No. This is great. This is great.
Yeah.
You're the guest, and I've been speaking for almost 15 minutes, and I've given you 2 words. Then we move into the psychoanalytic period. Mm-hmm. Haven is interesting. It's almost its own book in this, because it's a history. It's really more in method like these early books, but it hints of the concerns of later middle and late Lasch.
Well, he described the culture of narcissism as an outgrowth of Haven and a Heartless World, which is why, ideas come from somewhere, right? And this is one of the things which really interests me, and which in my own writing I am trying to figure out is not just a periodization, but why one thing naturally rises out of the other. And so if your concern in Haven and a Heartless World is with the institution of the family, and your basic argument is that the institution of the family is a maligned thing in American life, which is overburdened and which has conflictory or contradictory roles in both forming the basis of personality and the regulation of emotions as relates to marriage, then Freudianism is a pretty natural place to go from there. But it's not Freudianism. It's the questions which result in Freud as an answer, basically.
Right. Yeah. So as I said in the interview, he states that he comes to Freudianism to answer the questions of kind of why Haven and Heartless World is poorly received and abused by conservatives. So he's concerned with both things. Why is the left reacting so strongly to this? And when they hadn't to his prior books, right?
Yeah.
And then why is the right? I've been criticizing the left now and liberals now for 15 years. Why is the right all of a sudden interested in what I have to say? And that seems to lead him to Freudianism, which was already there. And this is one thing I want to point out. He was already dealing with Marcuse and the Frankfurt School, and Foucault, as an unfortunate Cine Journal article once pointed out, but quite accurately, a lot of these French and German Freudian-Marxist and post-Marxist were in his vocabulary, and he knew about them, very early on. I mean, I know Foucault is so de rigueur now that we assume that's always the case, but finding him in an essay in 1969 is actually kind of weird.
Yeah.
In America. Like that's before the Stanford conference really blows everything out of the water.
I've got like a second edition of the American History of Sexuality over there. And, who appears on the back cover talking about how it's a vital book? It's Christopher Lasch.
Lasch, yeah.
And, in some ways, Lasch is concerned with a lot of aspects of American history that correspond neatly to things Foucault is concerned about in terms of French history. So you see this in the World of Nations essay on the history of the asylum.
Exactly. That's a great point.
Yeah. And then you also, which is obviously, this is like a third of Discipline and Punish, is on like the asylum or total institutions or whatever.
And the concern about the therapeutic is something that
this is like Foucault's famous phrase. It's one of his famous phrases, and it's also one of Lasch's famous phrases.
It's funny to me that when we talk about Foucault now, his concerns about the therapeutic are largely dropped, and we only talk about biopower.
It's especially because I find the therapeutic is a much more compelling idea than biopower is.
Yeah, but I think we also need to talk about the difference between Foucault and Lasch, because Foucault deals in epistemes, and he's totally unfucking interested with how these ideas change and the mechanisms for these changes in ideas. Like when you read the way he talks about epistemes, even in like Discipline and Punish, right? Are the history of madness, the big one.
Yeah.
There's two problems with Foucault. One, Foucault early on takes literary text way too much at face value. And two, because he makes some historical errors because he's taking literary text at face value. But two, people have noticed this, and a lot of Marxists have noticed this. He's not interested in how the shift happened. He's just interested in that it happened. And then you have one episteme and another episteme, and then you have one genealogy and another genealogy.
I mean, you have like thrown in, social control, right? Like he's like, it's social control.
Right. But that's
which is obviously an oversimplification.
Right. Will to power, blah, blah, blah. It's what you got.
But with Lasch, what you have is especially in Haven and a Heartless World, tremendous attention paid to what these changes were, why these changes were conducted, who they were designed to benefit, and who conducted these changes. And so you have something which appears in the way it's commonly discussed, and certainly how it was discussed at the time, as a natural shift, changing modes of family life, connected to historical progression, and just responding to generalized conditions in society. And in Haven and a Heartless World, this becomes a really purposeful thing. I actually think he pays too much attention to the way the helping professions predominate in this change, which is kind of the point of the book. So it's not, I don't think he disagreed that there are a lot of other impeti. It's just that these are the people he's researching. But what is really tremendously interesting about it is the purposeful way in which a historical trend is examined and conducted, and in how you say, people did this.
One of the things I find interesting about that in particular about Haven, is you think we talk about social reproduction theory, even though it's implied in Das Kapital, it's kind of talked about by Pierre Bourdieu. It's crucial to Marxist feminism. But Lasch is actually writing about it before it's common in even academic Marxism. Like it's like, yes, it is being discussed about in Europe and autonomia movements and stuff, because concurrently to Lasch's work in Haven, is kind of almost convergent evolution there. But it's interesting to me because of the particular ire between Lasch and feminists, that Lasch actually is one of the few male Marxist-inspired writers who take social reproduction theory very, very seriously.
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's a huge part of, you know, it starts showing up even early on, even before Haven, in the essays in World of Nations, where he's talking about like this weird class of women who were being drug out to the West and were very bored, often married to petite bourgeois or small landholding men, but really were not part of the working class anymore, nor were they truly bourgeois or empowered, and how that was sentimentalized later by middle 20th century feminists looking for a history but pulling out all the class context.
Yeah.
You would think Marxist feminists would love that shit.
Or like the stuff in the New Radicalism, like the chapter like Woman as Alien, right? You know, or the stuff on Mabel Dodge Luhan, right?
Yeah, his stuff on Mabel Dodge Luhan is amazing, and it's early. I mean, I like that's somebody who's talked about by feminists a lot more now than at the time Lasch was writing.
Yeah, no, that's like absolutely. And you know, it speaks to one of the things we were discussing off air, which is how much Lasch has in common, where he's addressing a lot of similar questions over large sections of his life, which returns us to periodization, because I want to hear the remainder of these periods now that we've.
Then we have the psychoanalytic period, which I start with. I start with a book that then leads to another book, which becomes a bigger selling book, which is to explain the first book. And then he writes a third book, which is not as commonly read, but I think it's actually the best of the three, The Minimal Self, which
The Minimal
exists.
Self is my favorite of Lasch.
Okay, good. We agree. Because I'm like, The Minimal Self is like, because that's where everything, that in True and Only Heaven are where things are made explicit.
Yeah. And also very, very little in Revolt of the Elites, and also very, very little in a couple of sections in World of Nations.
Right.
But like Minimal Self, like this last section on the various types of politics and how they're connected to like different aspects of psychoanalysis, it completely fascinating. Plus, I think he examines in The Minimal Self what is a real you know, he kind of ignores the 1930s and 40s in a lot of his stuff, which is very weird, with one major exception, which is his examination of the Holocaust and the impact of the Holocaust on thought and on intellectual proclivities in society more generally, which I think is a really, really interesting chapter of the book.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, it is actually interesting that you think like the only other time he talks about the 1940s is when he's talking about Black nationalism,
or in True and Only Heaven, when he's talking about the like distrust of democracy by members of the Brain Trust.
Yeah. But in general, he avoids those 2 decades, which I have not thought about till right now, Elijah, and that's a great point, because I'm like, no, it's very much 18, like
it's 1870 to 1920, and then history picks up again in 1952.
Right.
And I mean, he speaks to like a little bit like Whittaker Chambers' turn, and he speaks to like the co-optation of the Communist Party.
Right. He writes that whole thing about FDR, but
it's alluded to. It's not examined explicitly.
Like there's one line in World of Nations where he says FDR basically, as part of a dying Brahmin quasi-capitalist class, gleams on to both the progressive movement as a bridge,
and like the socialist movement as a future.
As a bridge with the socialist movement and the populist movement to come up with something to survive, for this capital to survive, which is his explanation of the beginnings of Fordism, but it's a sentence.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like that. Like people, there are a lot of criticisms of Lasch, but there's very little criticism of what is his most glaring error, which is not addressing the Great Depression.
Yeah, it's just not there.
And I don't think I'm sad about it, because I think he's a really good thinker, and I would have loved to hear what he had to say about this period, but thankfully, there's a lot without it, but it's a glaring omission, and it's something which is really unfortunate.
I'm going to write another essay one day where I explain how I use Paul Maddock Sr. to fill in the missing parts of Lasch.
You have like, that's hilarious.
except that Paul Maddox Sr. and Lasch do not share. Let me rephrase it. I think Paul Maddox Sr. is actually more correct about what mid-century Keynesianism actually was than Lasch ends up being. But it's interesting to me, this glaring error. And there's a couple in Lasch that I think are interesting. The other one that I was mentioning to you is like, Lasch complains that the populists, for example, in his early work, do not have a significant understanding of what the classes are, either in economic terms, but even more particularly for him in cultural terms. And Lasch also chastises Marxists in general for not taking culture seriously, as seeing it as, all superstructure. And while Lasch doesn't use this language at all, he very much reminds me of people who come out of the more classically Hegelian Marxist schools, who insist that relations of production are as important as modes of production, and in fact explain them. And thus, when you think about it, cultural and legal forms cannot be bracketed out of modes of production, and that it's a necessary bourgeois illusion for it to seem like they are separate, but they are not.
My technical, the name for my major is technically Bachelor's in Science in Industrial and Labor Relations. So as one can guess, this is like a concept which I am very interested in, which is, where is the boundary between the law, between modes of enforcing labor relations and the actual production process?
Right. I think when you see this in Lasch's inability to figure out if Mormon sharecroppers are working class or not, it's like, and admittedly, I will admit that like sharecropping fucks with Marxist class categories, unless you just want to call them peasants. And no one wants to do that, because then you have this whole new problem that emerges because you're accusing a bourgeois society of having feudal hangovers.
Well, this is where maybe Genovese had a little bit of influence. This is one of his main contentions, is that the South was simultaneously pre-capitalist and like capitalist. And Genovese misses a lot, so I don't want to suggest that people should go and read Genovese and
Eugene Genovese, in the book that you should start off with is Roll Jordan Roll, and ignore everything he did after 1981.
But in an essay collection called Towards a New Past, which I do recommend any listeners read, and it has the essay on the Congress for Cultural Freedom in there too. It's a really good collection. It's very short, and it has an essay by Genovese on a Marxist interpretation of the slave South, which attempts to address a lot of these questions about how the South was, it's exists in some ways outside of Marxist and traditional Marxist class interpretations.
Right, and it throws Marx for a loop too, honestly. Like, one thing that I've looked at,
which is hilarious, because he should have an explanation for it, because he was a journalist writing about America during the Civil War.
Well, yeah, he does, but he comes up with he does have an explanation for it. The explanation for it is both it's capitalist and not. I think about the first man to use sociology in English, who was a slavery defender, who was arguing that this was an anti-capitalist form of organization, and in many ways Marx is pushing back on that and saying it's pro-capitalist. But there are times in his journalism and writing where he also says this is a regression, it's pre-capitalist formations, it's a more brutal form of capital. Yeah, and you're right. Marx is writing journalism all over the New York newspapers. Specifically for the proto-radical Republicans, right?
He's writing letters to Abraham Lincoln. He's like, you need to talk about this, which is awesome.
Right. It's quite interesting to think about. But what's funny about Genovese is that Genovese is basically presaging the whole new history of slavery debates. 20 years later, by saying, it actually is capitalist, but has some shit in it that's not.
Yeah.
And
I think that's exactly it, which is why it's so funny that a lot of people in the new history get their start by being like incredibly anti-Genovese for many very reasonable reasons. Which
Yeah,
is
I mean,
turn.
yeah,
But
because he becomes a hyper conservative in the 80s, and a particularly dishonest one. I mean,
Yeah.
like he does some things that damage the history profession, like in the late 80s and 90s. There's a book about that whose name just slips my mind. It's written by a fairly liberal historian, but goes into like what Genovese is accused of. I love Chris Lehman explaining that though his battles with Lasch ends up with him being relegated to the classics department and teaching histories of American slavery and classics as he becomes more and more conservative. But yeah, I think Genovese is there, and we talked about this with Paul Sweezy. So then we have the end. All right, so this is what I call the period of despair. This is when Lasch is struggling to reconceptualize what working class politics and the left's relationship is after the left seems to collapse in the 70s into the 80s. And then while I never think he was a believer in the Reagan Revolution, he actually seems, and people miss this in his writing, particularly distraught that this is what American conservative came up with.
Yeah, I mean,
Reaganism.
This
right?
is like, I think he has a lot of respect for American conservatism. And I think any person who's serious about examining history should have respect for doctrines, even that they radically disagree with. And what he sees as a lot of underlying strong elements, like a focus on limits that he gets from, say, like the Southern agrarians, and that he sees as examples of some of the best like interests, almost like historical interests of conservatism. The replacement for this historical philosophy is like a California actor who's just like got like a sunny disposition and a we can do it attitude. And so what he sees Reagan as in many ways is an attempt to smooth over a crisis which conservatives and serious conservative thinkers historically had been very aware of. In primarily, I don't know, Richard Weaver, the agrarians, like all guys who I disagree with, but who are important for understanding the history of conservative thought. So Reagan represents not only a reason to be distraught because of his effectiveness in co-opting huge sectors of the working class behind a really despicable form of politics, but also because he presents an attempt to smooth over and pretend that underlying conflicts in American society don't exist, rather than a genuine attempt to engage with them.
Right.
Which is
this is when racial animus starts being spoken in code as opposed to directly, like all this stuff.
He presents, he's like he's in alliance with workers while being anti-union in his own perception. Peace through strength, right? Reagan has a particularly pernicious form of doublespeak, which for somebody who wrote a book called Plain Style, this is not plain style, and this is one reason why Reagan is somebody who Lasch is so disheartened by and so frightened of, I think.
Right. It's interesting to me that the beginning of of movement conservatism's heyday and the end of movement conservatism into whatever we have now, which my frenemy John Corman came on and spoke about this, and we have to admit this, from 1976 until literally, let's say, the middle of Obama's presidency, everything done was defined by movement conservatism That's what defined the Atari Democrats. That's what defined the DNC. That's what defined Clinton triangulation. The prime mover in America was dealing with movement conservatism, but movement conservatism was a coalition of groups that never made sense and could only be held together by doublespeak in an empty suit.
And by opposition to Keynesianism that they killed, and
continue to bring up as a specter, even though no one really thought it was revivable.
Yeah.
And by pretending it was communist too, that's another funny part of it.
Which is very, very funny and very sad, and fits neatly into the doublespeak.
Mm-hmm.
And Reagan he really perfected this.
Right. I think the irony is Trump is the dark mirror image of that. Trump also speaks in doublespeak. Trump also has a different but incoherent coalition. Trump is also basically, he's the poor person's idea of what a rich person would be. He is second generation nouveau riche.
Yeah.
And he's more or less known as a businessman, but for being an actor.
He does things, which are like comical. I can't believe that's real. His ex-wife Ivana died and he buried her on his golf course so that he doesn't have to pay taxes on it. This is way more depressing than the fact that Reagan effectively triumphed over the left. The fact that Trump temporarily did, or maybe permanently, we don't know at this point, because he's so much dumber and he falls into these things which we've had literally decades to work out an opposition mechanism to, and just comes in dumber and brasher than ever and succeeds in it. And so I think pointing him out as dark Reagan or whatever is a really effective way of putting it, because he carries out many of the same
functions. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, one of the things that Spencer Leonard and I actually agree with is the internal fighting, and the internal fighting even in the class base. And we could talk about this about Republicans, right?
Yeah.
The class base of Republicans is an income base that roughly co-aligns with the petite bourgeoisie, but it's not really the same. You can use it. You can look at the income base and go, okay, these are people who make less than $200,000 a year, but more than say $80,000 in Sun Belt states and in the Rust Belt.
Mm-hmm.
Well, who are they likely to be? Petit bourgeois, community leaders, well-off workers, but people who have seen things go down. And then there's this. Clive Barrow has the thesis that the white lumpen bourgeoisie is the non-voting shock base of Trump, and then he implies that the black lumpen bourgeoisie is the non-voting shock base of the Democrats, but he doesn't say that explicitly because he thinks he'll get backlash. That's me projecting, but I think it's implied in what he said. I don't know that I completely agree with that, but the stats kind of bear that out, with the exception that that people are not dealing with the fact that that in the last 4 years in particular, the Democrats' class base has been upwardly mobile. And Lehman talks about this in terms of Hillary Clinton, but what this lately it's been really stark, where it's you need a graduate degree to be yes, any kind of higher education is liberalizing. You have. If you get a BA, 60% of those people are going to become more liberal than they thought. But the stats also support that about 30 to 40% of people who go through undergrad actually have a conservatizing response where they double down.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen in grad school. Those people are selected out for whatever reason.
Well, it's because I think, based on my experience as an undergraduate now, it's because a lot of them are so despondent at the conditions of the intellectual conditions of their undergraduate education that they're like, are you kidding? A grad degree? I don't want to spend a minute with these people, and you're expecting me to spend another several years? Like, absolutely not.
Right. And I say this as a person who like got a grad degree because this is what you were supposed to do. My younger brother, two of my younger brothers are high school dropouts, and then one of my younger brothers has a doctorate, although it's a doctorate in physical therapy. It's not an MD or a PhD. But so we both have high level graduate educations. None of our parents did. Our mother was the first person to get a university degree in our direct line, and she only did so in her 40s. So she was a waitress most of our lives, particularly mine. The reason why I say this, though, is like I also would tell people not to get a grad degree now, particularly in the humanities, but even in the sciences. And I also have become enamored with the theories of Jeff Smith from the late 90s. I've been somewhat repopularized by Daniel of What is Politics fame, of the discipline mind thesis, that the discipline and training of even scientific graduate. Yes, it's obvious in humanities degrees, but even in science, leans people towards certain things, and it's not just political. In fact, it actually separates them from their ability to speak to the working class, etc. I think that thesis is broadly speaking true, and I'm a person who rejects like the quote PMC thesis, right? But with all this said, the Democrats' class base they've been arguing that it was a class base based on racial allegiances, more or less.
Yeah, I mean, it's a neoliberal version of the Rainbow Coalition since
right.
then.
Right. Which is ironic also, since Clinton's people forget this, but I like to remind people, Clinton's run against Obama was her trying to put on a Lasch suit. And we also need to remember that Hillary Clinton claims to have read Culture of Narcissism.
Yeah, she's like, yeah, me and Bill loved it. But I kind of think of that in the same way that Jimmy Carter talked about reading Culture of Narcissism, where Lasch, Jimmy Carter brought Lasch to Camp David at the same time as Daniel Bell to advise the Malaise speech.
And it's funny that people kind of link Daniel Bell and Lasch together. They're very different.
Yeah, I mean, and Lasch uses Daniel Bell as the prime example of the neoconservative politics of the superego in the minimal self in a way that directly contrasts them, and shows that they have way more differences than they have similarities. But anyway, and Lasch is like asking Jimmy Carter, he's like, Mr. President, how did you have time to read my book? It's very complicated. And Jimmy Carter's like, well, I've gotten really good at speed reading. Which is what a hilarious thing to say. But, I kind of imagine that the Clintons had somewhat of a similar experience with it, which is a very cursory overview of a book that they hoped would give them some insight, because obviously they do want insight into how to get themselves elected or govern or whatever. And, if you don't read it closely and you don't read it carefully, it winds up convincing you that Lasch is saying exactly what you already thought. And so this is kind of my feeling on the way a lot of people, including the Clintons, but also more broadly, the post-left and right-wingers and many left-wingers read Lasch, which is in a way that evades the things he's actually trying to say and uses the fact that he's understandable and easy to quote from, because a lot of what he says is really profound and sounds really profound, in order to justify what they thought already. Right.
Well, this is exactly what bugged me. Again, it's more on my show, so I can name names. So, I've now outed one of the infamous 3 Varn conservative mentors. But also my response to Angela Nagel, and we were on the same side. And I did not hate all of Kill All Normies. I will say that. Like, I will defend elements of that book to this day. I wrote a long critique of it, though, when we accepted it as zero, where I talked about its lack of knowledge of history of the far right, that it overattributed things to meme culture. But it did explain some things that, like, why certain tactics that the far right had used that had failed. Like, okay, so for example, the rebranding of paleo-conservatism, and particularly its fascist adjacent ring into alt-right, was an explicit attempt to bring the youth in, and by the youth we mean Gen Xers. We're not even talking about millennials. With an aesthetic, you know, that didn't work. It is ironically saved by Hillary Clinton as a moniker. Because people who follow Richard Spencer may know this, but most people don't actually. He was a person that kind of came out of nowhere and was kind of a distraction from more important movements later.
He's also now he's like a pro-NATO, like Clintonite, actually.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all.
He's like the 90s are proof that he's like, if the Democrats were the party of governance, they should just be the party of white governance.
Yeah,
which like completely bizarre, but you know,
that's been his politics for a while, though. I mean, like, ironically, his reading of Paul Gottfried and Adorno and Marcuse leads him to be like, well, but like 90s liberalism, but for white people.
Yeah, no, basically, like.
But not surprising given his battles within paleoconservatism, honestly. But that didn't work, right? Until the memification happened, irony poisoning happened, etc. The need to transgress. Ironically, a lot of this is also embodied by Nagel's own response to getting canceled for writing for American Affairs and going on Tucker Carlson and agreeing with him. A cancellation that she kind of self-enforced, in my absolute opinion, because other people have done similar things and paid no price for it. But my point with Nagel was, I wrote this response about this, but I said parts of this were good, and then I heard her speak on Christopher Lasch, and ironically, she bailed out to debate Sargon of Akkad one day when she'd agreed to speak on Lasch with Doug Lane, and Lasch calls me in. Doug calls me in to talk on Lasch because he knows that I knew Lasch very well. Yeah. I also came from this conservative background. This began the project that would become my book with Shallon. That's probably going to take 3 or 4 more years for me to write. But people were like, when's that book coming out? I'm like, I don't know, when I finish it. I'm literally reading every fucking thing written about the man or the man wrote.
Yeah. So like, people will be able to read my much more cursory whatever I publish while they whet their appetite for what I assume is going to be much more cohesive overview. Because I'm kind of sticking with his books plus the Tikkun article because there's enough there for a lot. Though
there's tons there.
There's tons there. Which, you know, I mean, like, I'm sad that I'm not going to be examining his letters or whatever, but you know, my thesis advisor looked at my outline and was like, "Hey, this is a book. This is not a thesis." And I was like, "Okay, I'll cut it down."
Well, I mean, what happened to me is I was like, let's write a 200-page pamphlet-y book on Lasch for leftists. It was originally what the working title was called, and then it became a like, I'm like, oh my God, if I write what I want to write, this is going to be an 800-page book that no one's going to read.
I'll read it.
That I'm writing as a para-academic. So what I think is going to happen is we probably are going to like cull it down to like 200 words, but we'll be shopping essays from the excerpt for like a decade. But the interesting thing is Shallon is a historian of she's actually a historian of the public reception of pop culture. She's a cultural historian of the 90s. She's also trained in history of science.
Yeah.
And
she must be a very, very good reader of Lasch then.
Yeah, she is.
These are like the two doctrines which history of science is really ignored in reading Lasch. but it's very, very important. Like you could see, like, you know, the sort of Thomas Kuhn or people like this are really useful in examining him because of how he addresses technology,
Right.
Which is not, in my opinion, in the most cohesive way. Like one of my other big critiques, along with my critique that he just leaves out the New Deal, is I think, and this is like really sad considering how he died, he's not optimistic enough or hopeful enough, or whatever you want to call it, on medical technology.
Yeah, this is a problem that I have with the true and only heaven, and this is where my logical positivist training comes in. I'm not a logical positivist. I'm more of a Hegelian ultimately, but like there's part of me that has like this rigid, like analytic philosopher backbone somewhere in there that I've just suppressed that comes out when we talk about progress. And it's why I both agree with a lot of Lasch's critique there, but then I'm also like, but when you talk about progress, when you critique progress qua progress, right, you're actually accepting the terms of progress qua progress.
Yeah.
So you're not domain limiting it. We really have had progress in medical development. Like,
yeah, like, you know, I completely agree, which is why you may have found me like arguing with various people in the Know Your Enemy guys mentions recently, where I'm like, well, you know, this is much more interesting if you just limit it to an argument about moral progress and how we think of it. But if you're taking it, you know, at face value, which you can for a lot of his writing, and it turns into an argument that there hasn't been technological progress under the terms of technological progress, completely false. You know, like if he had gotten his cancer a decade from when he did, he'd still be alive.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely. I was about to say my ex-wife had a far more pernicious and dangerous form of cancer, and she's still here.
Yeah, my grandmother got pancreatic cancer like 5 years ago, and she's still around. You know,
we do have domain specific progress, but moral progress, you know, here's where I come back on the side of Lasch.
Moral progress is something which is a much more contentious issue, and it's much easier to argue that we don't have it because it's a question of ethics and it's a question of justice, not a question of can we keep people alive biologically for longer.
Right. Well, I mean, I think this is just also in general when I hear the Steven Pinkers of the world, and there's a general assumption in the skeptic community, even in the Virginia Heffernan, like post-structuralist loosey-goosey version of that progress is real. We live in the best time in history, blah, 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 blah. And that I think is a joke.
Yeah,
like,
I mean,
I just think it's a joke. I don't think it means anything. I don't think
the best arguments against Steven Pinker are stuff like, yeah, you know, there's a smaller percentage of people living in poverty than ever before, but there's also a larger absolute number of people. Or this may not be like exactly true, but there's tremendous numbers of people living in absolute poverty. So, you know,
no, it actually is true that there's, even though we've seen a net reduction in poverty as far as the percentage in raw numbers, it's absolutely, it's actually how the case that like as it, and I think people, this needs to sit with people a little bit. Slavery has more people enslaved now than in the 19th century. It's just we're dealing in such a different order of scale of humanity that it's a much smaller percentage of the world population. It's like less than 1. But in raw numbers, no, you're more like you're not statistically more likely to be born into it, but there's more people in it now than even in the 19th century.
And one error of Lasch in arguing against technological progress is he's not arguing against it on these terms. Right. You know, like he's an American historian. He's focused on America. And for that reason, a lot of global poverty kind of passes him by in terms of...
this is my critique of Lasch, is that he's right that the American left has lost its way, and he's right. Like, he does see imperialism as a problem. He does talk about like the George Kennan statement, that an accurate statement, by the way, that like 48% of the world's wealth was left in America just because of an accident in World War II. You know, and then the Keynesian International, and this is where Paul Maddock actually explains what happens with that way better than Lasch does. Lasch isn't that terribly interested in it. Lasch sees he talks about it offhand, actually. Like, one of the things, even in the Tikkun essays, he talks about how, like, the left is not dealing with imperialism and what's happening in other parts of the world, but he doesn't include that in his analysis of the American left very well.
Yeah.
Like, it comes up like 5 times, and like in the books that we talk about, it comes up, for example, when he talks about in the kind of infamous essay "Is Revolution Obsolete in World of Nations," where he's talking about what essentially are bourgeois decolonial,
like worshiping like third worldists,
right,
like Mao, kind of ignoring what is efficacious in their own history for understanding the conditions of America.
right.
But
And
on the other hand, you should also understand these other positions,
right, because it leads him, for example, and just he for example, in the same book, says that it's the Kennedys who really give impetus to the American left and the new left, and I think that's partially true, but it does totally miss, like, the fact that this is coming out of the seeming world revolutionary period where the British and French empires are totally collapsing and America is assuming the mantle, but in a completely different way. Like,
I mean, no, I completely agree. Which, like, I think, we're spending a lot of time nitpicking particular aspects of him, which we're disappointed in because we've spent so long learning from him.
Right. I think this is different than a lot of other people who, like, go in looking for the nitpicks so they can ignore what he says is true.
Yeah. Like, these are oversights which on some level I don't even blame him, because he came up with so much other important stuff. And, it's really hard to write 10 books. That's a lot of work in addition to the innumerable articles that you've read.
Yeah, I mean, my God, the man. I mean, I will say most of the early period books are actually collections of essays, but I was, Shallon and I have talked about this when, like, we try to dig into, like, I've now got a collection of, like, every essay I can find by the man, including, like, his introductions to books, like his essay on Pierre Bourdieu, his essay on Norman O'Brown, and these are not any books, but
the Brown stuff finds its way into the Minimal Self some,
but and also into the introduction to the second edition of Norman O'Brown's major work. But in general, like, particularly during that time period between Minimal Self and then True and Only Heaven, which is a long time. Like, for a guy who turned out a book like every 2 years for most of his career, and then he turns out a bunch of stuff as he's dying of cancer, there's a long time where there's no book, and you're like, why? And I'm like, it's because he's writing a bajillion essays. He's writing for the New Republic. He's writing, who, by the way, I love that Lehman pointed out, even though he wrote for them all the time, they skewer him over and over and over again unfairly. He's writing a
lot for Tikkun.
And
for Salmagundi, which I have a collection of his stuff in Salmagundi right over there. Most unpronounceable name for anything in the world. But it's like a lot of it is he's spending time. He's kind of playing defense in the early 80s for a lot of his stuff, is justifying things he said in The Culture of Narcissism and in The Minimal Self and in Haven, and kind of playing catch up with some of his critics, especially in the Salmagundi essays, and also in the Tikkun essay that we've referenced a couple of times.
Yeah, it's really it's the problem with the right and the left has no future.
Yeah, which does find its way into True and Only Heaven. In the last chapter. Right.
It's reworked into the last chapter, True and Only Heaven, although he's taken a lot of the stuff he said in the initial Tikkun article out. And the reason why is he's no longer a sanguine on the communitarians. But it's a very interesting book. And I do think, like, if you want to find equal, like, the problem becomes, though, is as soon as Lasch dies, and this is not Elizabeth Lasch Quinn's fault.
Yeah.
As soon as Lasch dies, the right seizes on him like white on rice. It's amazing how fast. You got Roger Kimball. For those of you who don't know, that's New Criterion. New Criterion is basically the humanities intellectual journal of reactionaries.
Yeah, and actually,
it vulgarly so too.
Does mention in Revolt of the Elites that the New Criterion is an interesting new intellectual project.
Right. Well, that's before Roger Kimball had let his cards.
Yeah, I mean, it was a more interesting intellectual project prior to the change in editorship.
Right.
You know, people like the people in Chronicles, Paul Gottfried plugs into Lasch, partially because
I mean, that's because they both have a relationship to Marcuse.
What?
Paul Gottfried is Marcuse's student, and Lasch had actually mentioned Gottfried positively because Gottfried has a relationship to Telios, which is another weird part of my intellectual history. But the right-wing Frankfurt School is wild, and by that I don't mean Habermas right-wing, as in liberal. I mean like when they were like Paul Picone is what's it called? Amy Therese was like. Somebody was like, you have to understand Paul Picone to understand Amy Therese. And then I'm like, there's some truth to that, actually, even though Amy Therese is like the dumbest form of that.
Yeah, it's like, yes, this is organic negativity or whatever, you know, like.
But Paul Picone is the guy who also, like, even though it was a Frankfurt School journal, went and brought over a lot of the French New Right. So, like Alain de Bonney, School de la Méfé, those people, and did a Telios article pushing them, and so it makes and of course Paul Gottfried was there, and so it is interesting. I was surprised going back and reading that Tikkun essay closely because that Tikkun essay mentions Paul Gottfried positively, but I also am like, but Paul Gottfried wasn't the Paul Gottfried we know yet.
No, his early stuff was like examinations of Marx.
Right, and the strange non-death of what managerial liberalism, I think, is one of his better. I actually think that book's decent.
I mean, Paul Gottfried is one of them. He's very interesting, just like as a guy, because of the route his life took. And I think one reason why Lasch is so seized upon by the right is because a lot of his friends, or the people he interacted with, were on the right. Like Genovese, who obviously he had some contention,
big issues with, but
like Gottfried, who was at Rochester for a while, I believe, like the Telos people, so I think people tend to be nice to people they're around, which maybe, led to a lot of these right-wingers mistaking what Lasch was saying based on private conversation. Who knows? Like, this is moving backward in a way that we can't.
Yeah, I don't have any letters that
I don't have anything that proves this, but I do just think, well, he was around a lot of people, including many right-wingers.
I think this is one of the interesting developments with Lasch that we can't answer and we shouldn't try to answer, but is tempting. Is what I like to call the Sam Tannenhouse Whittaker Chambers problem. By that I mean Whittaker Chambers, and I know I'm going to sound weird as like a hyper unorthodox Marxist who's going to defend Whittaker Chambers because Whittaker Chambers ends up being a liar, but parts of the defense of his stuff and Witness are like ludicrously ad hoc later in the 90s. One of the things I think, however, to be fair, I do think that there are members of the Communist Party who threatened to out him as a homosexual, and that alienated him. And the only place he found where people would interact with him fairly was religious anti-communist, and that became a path dependency for Chambers. Even though he's, Sam Tannenhouse likes to defend him, that he would not have gone down even the Russell Kirk variety of conservatism, much less Reaganism or Trumpism. And I think that's probably true, but I do think this is a problem. So I say we see this with Nagel, and this is one of the sympathetic things I will say about her. In her self-imposed exile, the only people who will talk to her is Malcolm Schwayuna, who works for Oikos. And for people who don't know what that is, that means that Malcolm works for a think tank that is part of the Sweden Democrats, which is a post-fascist party, and it shows up in his politics. He likes writing in English because a lot of the people in the post-left that are famous in America are people who are
effectively alienated themselves from
their own political trajectories in their home countries.
Including Amy Therese, who
Right.
Didn't have much of a political trajectory from what I know about her, but she's an Australian who spends all of her time writing about American politics.
Yeah, she's a Malachite Catholic Australian.
Common route for Australian conservatives,
right?
Based on the Murdochs.
Well, I mean, usually they actually start with British politics and then move over to American.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's what the normal trajectory is. That's also how most Canadian, like a fuck lot of the intellectual dark web conservative branches are Canadians who did the same thing, since the Canadian Tory tradition doesn't really produce that many intellectuals anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing where Lasch is very different is, it seems to me like, from what little I know about him, he was on very good terms with like Michael Lerner and the guys in Tikkun, who were not right wing at all, right?
Right. He was also, even some of the feminists who polemicized against him, he was actually, apparently him and Lillian Rubin were still fairly friendly.
Yeah. And this is one of the things I really like about spending so much time with him, figuratively speaking, is, I was telling this to you before the show, he seems like a pretty nice guy, which is very different from a lot of thinkers and historians and philosophers who seem like terrible people, but you have to take their ideas seriously because they're just so smart. Which I don't know. I mean, a lot of this comes down to like, we're examining him from a vantage point where he didn't have the chance to either rehabilitate some of his errors by focusing his scholarship more on working class history and evading some of the myth making, as you call it, in True and Only Heaven, or go down the path of like Paul Gottfriedization, right?
The thing is, I can't see him becoming an Alan Bloom or even a Jim Beasley.
I don't see that at all. But basically, just like, what I mean to say is, we don't know what would have happened.
Yeah, we don't know what happened, and I think it's interesting. What I think is so sad, though, is we kind of been hitting at, is really from about 1997 to the Trump moment, where his students finally start pushing against this. This is when both Kevin Mattson and Chris Lehman really start speaking publicly, like, "Hey guys, stop it!" Right? But what isn't addressed is that the entirety of the aughts, if you're talking about Christopher Lasch outside of an academic territory, the only people talking about him are right wingers. It starts with Roger Kimball trying to appropriate him. Then you start seeing essays on him in City Journal. Then you see essays on him in like conservative blog spaces like Front Porch Republic. This is around 2009, 2010. American Conservative does stuff with him. The Claremont Institute tries to
Chronicles does stuff with him.
Yeah, Chronicles does stuff with him. First Things does stuff with him. And there are leftists writing about him. Andrew Hartman, the Trotskyist, writes about him a little bit. People write about him in a strange relationship to Harold Cruz, the guy who wrote Problems of the Negro Intellectual. And then one of the things with Negro Intellectual is becomes Harold Cruz's relationship to the CIA, which is funny because Lasch is the first person. I mean, Lasch's Congress of Cultural Freedom stuff, man, he's writing about that. I don't think people realize how radical it is when he was writing. Yeah, he's writing about that like 10 years after the fact. Nobody else confirms that stuff until like literally the last 15 years, where they're like, when the documents get declassified and it like proves definitive Lasch was right.
Yeah, I mean, like that's like one of these incredible essays because it actually, it was a really radical critique. And the people who were doing this shit, like, read it and were like, oh, time to change course. You know, it's getting out into the popular lexicon.
Yeah, they're figuring out they're on to us.
They're on to
Basically.
us. They're on to us. Yeah. Which is like, you know, I mean, this is a very rare thing for an historian to do, because very few people write about, you know, if they write about working class radical history, very few people are writing about 10 years ago. They're writing about 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff in World of Nations we forget, because I think World of Nations and Agony of the American Left can be somewhat alienating to contemporary readers. Although I think it's funny because I use it to push back on this idea that a lot of the left critics of the left have now, that all the problems really begin with the new left. Because what Lasch effectively proves is like, nope, everything that's in the new left goes all the way back to the 1890s in some form.
Yeah. I mean, and this is like, for me, the thing which I like about him most is that he, you know, an underlying element of all of his scholarship is a respect for history, and a recognition that, like, you know, tradition does hang on our brains like a nightmare, to use like Marx's phrase, and that in some ways this is positive, such as in connection across generations, and it can be positive, but in other ways it's really, really detrimental and really negative. And it doesn't do anything to pretend it's not there. You have to really reckon with it, and you have to address it, and you have to understand it. And this is something which the left has been remarkably bad at, in part because a drive of the left is to make a radical break with all of the injustices in history, whereas a drive of the right is to fit us into, I mean, I don't really think most people on the right have a good understanding of history, but they really want to fit themselves within history.
Right. Whereas the left is you know, is a ruthless critique of all that exists. But in its Marxist turn, we are historicists.
Yes.
That's the great irony. It's like we think that history, even more than economics, even though economics is part of that, explains how we got here. And the radical break is because we can speak to history.
Yeah.
I think Lasch's ambivalence about Marxism, even though he's a dialectician, in fact, that's one of the blurbs in the back of his old books, right? He was an amazing dialectician, is that he thinks that by the 80s, dialectics is used to justify
lazy critique,
developmentalism, which he's not wrong about either. I mean, like he's also, you know, he's reading all this stuff from France that's leading to people like Baudrillard, and, you know, all these post-leftists, and everyone always likes, you know, there's this move now to blame the post-leftists for the decline of Marx, and I'm like, no, they're the symptom of it. The decline actually is the fucking French Communist Party and their whack-ass developmentalism that puts them sometimes to the right of the socialists. Yeah, like in multiple countries.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's absolutely the case. You know, and you can see this kind of in, I'm going to use the I word, in Israel, where the Labor Party is conclusively, despite the fact that it had some extremely radical roots, conclusively, you know, to the right of more radical parties in Israeli politics.
Right. Although, unfortunately, what that's actually functionally led to is there is no Israeli left anymore of any substance.
No, I mean, yes, like 100%.
When people talk about Kadima as the Israeli left, I about want to die.
No, I'm in complete, you know, I'm in complete agreement. Like I have on that shelf over there, Shlomo Averny. I don't know if you've read him.
Yeah, I've read Averny.
You know, and Averny is interesting because he's also historically cognizant. And so I like Averny, though I have way more critiques of Averny than I do of Lasch, because we're going to move away from Israel because this is like a whole other discussion.
Yeah, I was about to say, you and I will be accused of being Zionist, and I know I am not. I'm pretty sure you're not. So
I'm extremely critical of Zionism. but it is an interesting thing to study.
Yeah, Averni is though. Averni is interesting.
And Averni's like a total Zionist,
right?
I mean, he was a member of the Israeli Labor Party and the governing coalition in the 1970s.
But it's interesting that Lasch's reading of Averni leads him to actually pick onto something about Harold Cruz and Black Power.
Yeah.
Harold Cruz's cultural naturalism and the Black Power movement, which is like, well, when you're trying to base your collective subject revolutionary subjectude off of groups that were not trying to build a nation in the area they're acting in, they're trying to build a nation somewhere else. So there's a less oppositional relationship. And Pan-Africanism never forms up enough to to be the thing that like Israel is or the IRA is, which is the weaker form of it. And so that's his critique of Cruz. I mean,
it's a generalizable critique of a lot of diaspora politics and a lot of the weaknesses inherent in them. And this is very impactful on the American left because diaspora politics are very compelling for the American left. And it's a real problem that goes back to stuff like in the New Radicalism, where people who see themselves as maybe not part of the left, but part of a reformist tradition or a radical tradition, identify with people on the fringes of society in a way that eschews their own position, where they have much more of a capacity to change things. And it limits the agency both of that diaspora group and of the people researching it or studying it or trying to learn from it. And this is one of Lasch, this is one of the things I really like about Lasch is studying the American left. He's not studying the left generally. I mean, partially, but he's focused on the American left, and he's focused on even
his engagement with the European left is because the American left is obsessed with it and has forgotten his own history, so he's got to know it anyway.
No, exactly. And like this is something where, and I understand you're going to do a series on the national question and on stuff like this, which is we're venturing into some of that territory.
This is also something where I think Lasch actually ends up being pretty weak.
Yeah, I agree, but I think that the thing I like about it is that it's focused on your own history. It's not focused on history of things you don't have a connection to or you can't use or have not actually influenced you to the extent you think they've influenced you.
Like Lasch is not concerned about the Russian Revolution the way most of American left now fetishize it. He's concerned actually about
the American response to it.
Right.
And I think actually I wrote an essay which never got published anywhere right at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict about how there's some commonalities between Lasch's examination of the American liberals and the Russian Revolution and the way in which American liberalism now has addressed Ukraine, which is to see it as a mirror image of its own condition. And this is a tendency which is also true in reverse of the American left and things like the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, where things which happened over there and you should learn about and you should understand are not the same as things happening here.
Yeah, we use them as moral signposts for things happening here in a way that is totally distorting.
Absolutely.
And we also pretend, and I have debates with a lot of leftists now where I'm like, like Mike McNair, for example, who writes about the British left and the relationship of of neo-Kautskyism and a kind of softer Leninism, that's picked up by people like Donald Parkinson, but also picked up by Bhaskar Sankara. But I'm like, the funny thing about McNair is he actually openly speaks that he does not understand the U.S. situation and cannot speak to it. And a lot of the strategies that he's talking about are not designed for a non-parliamentary democracy. And so it's just not dealt with. It's just not dealt with, like, at all. It's not our context.
Yeah, and this is why stuff like Lasch's critique of Harrington is so important, is because this is our context.
Right.
It speaks to the limitations of the American left. Like, you've said a lot of times that it's mistaken to latch on to the Democratic Party, which is something I broadly agree with. But the reason it's so compelling is because it's very hard to discern alternate routes, especially in a contemporary world with, a real absence of genuine from the ground up social movements, a really weak labor union structure, which is, a part
Yeah,
of the
I know. We talk about the
Democratic Party.
revival of public sector unions, and I'm like, so we saw an uptick of 1.5%.
Yeah, I mean, like in the same way that I think like the labor union uptick, because it is true that there's a lot. It's very important. The Starbucks unionization movement and the REI unionization movement and the Amazon labor union. These are really important things to understand, and they offer a lot of lessons. But the lesson isn't labor unions are on the upswing. It's that, in some places, like Starbucks is a really great example where what it doesn't tell you is about a generalized labor movement upswing. What it tells you is that in particular sectors where highly educated people have become concentrated because of a dearth of jobs in sectors that they're trained for, their own relative precarity enables them to try to make good on the ideological promises of so-called progressive companies that they work for.
Right. Amazon being another, Bezos used to pretend to be progressive, but you will notice this is not spreading to conservative it's also not happening in conservative places, even though it's come close. It really hasn't popped off in the South.
Yeah, and this is partially because of the unique labor situation legalistically there, but it's also because a lot of this is a response to cultural factors in addition to economic factors, and it's articulated in a way that prioritizes cultural factors over economic factors pretty frequently, which is not something a lot of people on the left want to hear, because it affirms our own insularity and our own position as external to the broad processes underlying politics in American society right now. Does that mean that I think these things are bad because some people are going to question this? No. Obviously, it's preferable that even under these conditions, workers have the ability to point out hypocrisy from their employers and to take more oversight of their conditions and their workplaces. But it's not happening because of a generalized upswing of worker militancy in all of society, or as an aftermath to the Bernie campaign necessarily, though this could be a factor. It's happening.
Actually, I would argue that it's the reverse. If anything, there was a generalized uptick in unionization, mostly in reasserting public unionization after the Wisconsin fiasco in 2012, which people just bracketed out of the history for some weird reason. Which led to wildcat strikes in places like West Virginia eventually.
The Red Flag movement and stuff like that.
Right. What has happened, and that's very similar to the wildcat strikes in the post offices in the 70s, which is interesting. But people take that as a rebirth of labor. Well, in the 70s, that was actually a sign that things were about to fucking fall apart.
Yeah. You're using the last remaining space you can to get in there and have a better accord for the impending collapse.
Right. I mean, and I think it's telling that what people have not talked about, and I keep wanting to talk about it, is like during COVID, which you would have thought which have been in many ways would have made the essential workers more powerful. What you actually saw was a 2% decline of the overall labor movement from a point of the first time we've seen renewed growth again from 2012 forward. And I think this has not been done. The Jacobinite wing of the left does not really want to look at this at all.
Yeah.
The other thing that's been debated, and Lasch has been deployed in this, and so I want to talk to you about this. And in fact, I may pause the show and come back to this, so we'll do a whole episode on this. Is Lasch being conflated with the PMC debates, which I've talked a lot about, but I really want to get your take on that maybe later, because I think one of the things I am more frustrated with the PMC debates about is that in the 70s, okay, in the 30s and 40s, when James Burnham is coming up with the Managerial Revolution books, we are talking about an elite that is not defined by credentialization. People need to remember that only 40% of the population, when James Burnham writes the Managerial Revolution and the Machiavellians, which are the two books that are pertinent here, only 40% of the population has a high school degree. We're talking about maybe 10 to 15% have some form of higher education. All right. By the 1960s, you see this expansion of the university. Lasch talks about it, but we're still only dealing with 10-ish% of the population.
And Burnham also says that the managerial class is going to be concentrated in like the
military.
Yeah, the military, exactly. Not the educational sector or the corporate sector.
Right. It's a completely different thing. It's actually weirdly what the PMC does is it takes the managerial elite and the administrative theses of Frederick Pollock and the Frankfurt School and these kind of Trotskyist, and these kind of Trotskyist bureaucratic elite theories, which is what Burnham does actually for the right, was take Trotsky and remove the dialectics on purpose, like explicitly. His letter where he leaves the SWP is based off of, like, he doesn't believe in dialectical rules of history, but he actually keeps the bureaucratic collectivist part. But I just feel like when people talk about this, they need to realize they're talking about a political economy that is radically different than today. One of the things I find interesting about cultural narcissism is Lasch kind of intuits this. He intuits it weirdly by focusing on consumers. But the shift from high Taylorist disciplinary economy into Fordism, all right, and most of what he's writing about up into the minimal self is about Fordism. He can see that it's ending, and he starts seeing its ending in the 70s in the profitability crisis.
Yeah. He addresses the culture of narcissism to the same. I mean, in the introduction, he says this book is concerned with a style of personality which is ending, which is like such a fascinating thing because it's not what people take from it.
No, they think now is like the acceleration of the cultural narcissism, and I'm like, yeah, it's actually over.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, there's some commonalities because because history never ends, right? In the same way that the acquisitive personality type Lasch thinks led to the personality type in the culture of narcissism. But yuppies do not predominate anymore. Like,
no.
And whoever.
And the petite bourgeois values he's talking about basically don't exist anymore.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and so it's really inelegant when you use it to say, like, are we all narcissists? Like, I mean, I don't know about you, but my I don't have to sell my personality in an effort to navigate large corporations that are going to provide me with, a family wage.
No, I have to sell my personality for rent.
Yeah, like it's
different. It's an entirely different scenario.
Exactly. And so there's some like stuff like the minimal self. I think that a lot of the analysis of the concept of a minimal self still holds up really well.
Right. But if you were using Freudian terms, that's moving from narcissism into psychosis.
Yes. And the culture of narcissism is an outgrowth of the minimal self.
Right.
The particular form in which a minimal self can take shape in a society in which it's beneficial. That's not our society anymore. That's not our economy. That's not the way you survive. And therefore, the minimal self takes a completely different form. Or not completely different, but it takes a radically different form that makes a lot of the analysis in the culture of narcissism useful as a historical portrait of life in 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s.
It's describing the boomers, but
in describing the boomers, but it's not the millennials, which people think it is, and it's not Gen Zers, which they also think it is.
Right.
Which is a contributing factor to why Lasch is so utterly misused by the post-left, because
Right.
that's what we're trying to do.
Right. And when we get to the class stuff, this will become more apparent too. But like, because while I think Lasch is not the greatest on political economy, some things he's describing are actually kind of correct in the broad sense. But they're being misappropriated now, first by the right, then by the left, who, one of the things that got me into, like I've been saying, that got me into this reading of Lasch was me and Shallon sitting down after reading the essays of Lehman and Matson and a few of Lasch's students that came out around 2016 when Steve Bannon starts citing Lasch, where I go, okay, look, why is it not just that these right-wingers are doing this? I expect them to do this. But why is the Lasch often liked by people who back then were not calling themselves post-leftist yet? Why are they actually accepting the most conservative reading of Lasch? Like, why are they reading? It's like they read that essay, Conservative Leftism, and decided that was who Lasch was.
I mean, it's because
very weird.
They want a cudgel with which to oppose identity politics.
Which is a weird thing for a man who spent a whole lot of his life. Would you read the first four-ish books of Lasch, right? The only left group that Lasch says a lot of positive things about are black nationalists.
I mean, I think he's also positive about the populists, even in some of that early stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with the sentiment completely, and it's even more telling that, you know,
I mean, his critique of positivism is that it degenerates into conspiracism because it doesn't have a nuanced understanding of culture and political economy.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, it's like, yeah, no, that's exactly it. And then in True and Only Heaven,
he admits that they're racist. He just thinks there's other things that are important about them.
Yeah, in True and Only Heaven, he's like, he's like, yeah, I can only think of one movement that successfully combines a respect for limits and a spiritual discipline against resentment. MLK's civil rights movement.
Right.
You know, like, one of the biggest underlying commitments of his entire career is a firm opposition to racism. And, you know, this is not to say he'd be like all cool and good with identity politics.
He would not. He would probably read it a lot. He would read it like Adolf Reed reads it, probably.
Yes, exactly. And, but it is to say that if you're just using Lasch to oppose identity politics, you're misusing him maybe less than conservatives are, but
I don't know. I think you may be misusing him more than conservatives are.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe for ends that he'd dislike. I don't know. Like, we're not him.
I don't know. It's hard to say because
misuse of Lasch, like complete and utter misuse.
I mean, it's interesting because they apply his arguments that he has with feminists in the 70s and 80s to movements that he never applies that to. For example, like, you get the feeling that people would like to apply his critiques of, say, bourgeois feminism to, say, the civil rights movement. And that's something he explicitly doesn't do, and talks about the civil rights movement as one of the few left movements that had sincere and real working class support.
And that was incredibly successful for that reason.
And so it's a weird thing to think. No, he would not. I do not think Lasch would like the 1619 Project, but
he'd dislike it because he thinks the history is shoddy. He wouldn't dislike it because he disagrees with the aims of, you know,
although
eliminating racism in society or in opposing racism in society.
In our current inclinations, those things would be lumped together. I know how he'd be received.
Yeah,
I know how critics of the 1619 Project have in general been received for historical criticisms, even by people who are broadly speaking leftist. The one thing I would say is that, you know, that is worrying, but I don't know that. One of the things I can say that has quite frustrated me about the post-left, and this is beyond just Lasch, is that they critique the left ruthlessly and sometimes even correctly, but they do not critique the right at all.
Yeah.
And
they take it at face value.
They take it at face value, and I'm like, if you do that, I don't take you. I think you're a rightist, like, or at least a fifth columnist for them, because like, it's one thing to critique the left, but if you don't ever look at the right, you don't really understand what's going on. And here's where I do think some of this is accidental. Like, I always call it the Portland problem. By that I mean, I'm kind of picking at Doug Lane directly, and I'll say that on air. But Doug, when I tell Doug like political conditions in Utah or Georgia, he's like horrified. And I'm like, because you're extrapolating from Portland to the general United States. And like, yeah, I know like people like Robert Evans will try to do that from the opposite sense of the way. Like, the battles between Portland anarchists and the white nationalists from Idaho that kind of live in in Oregon. I'm like, yeah, but Oregon's a Klan colony. Like, that's its historical legacy. Like it was a Klan colony that also, Portland has also been important to Marxists. See, the movie Reds goes into this. But it's a weird historical bastion that the rest of the country, even the rest of the progressive country, does not share that history.
Yeah.
And extrapolating from that to the rest of the United States is kind of nuts.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think one other thing about the post-left is that based on how they write and how they speak, I'm under the assumption that a lot of them come from my class background, which is, an upper middle class.
I
Lower,
call it PMC and PMC violence.
Lower upper class,
PMC on PMC violence. It's all.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so if they just confine themselves to being like, yeah, this is why if they confine themselves to a critique of the way American liberalism currently operates in its upper levels in like private schools and, like Nantucket beach parties or whatever, congratulations. Like, you've got some good stuff there, but in failing to distinguish between that and what it says about the rest of society, it's not a coherent critique, and it's not something which people should pretend is coherent critique. It's something which is a bunch of stabs, largely in the dark, that occasionally hit the target of the guy sitting next to you.
I mean, like, Catherine Rue is right about the way California upper middle class intellectuals are, and right about like a kind of administrative bureaucratic elite, but that does not a political economy make.
Yeah,
like I'm often like, it's very frustrating because like I am at war with PMC as a coherent class theory, but I'm often in agreement
with descriptions of it as a cultural form,
as a cultural phenomenon, except when people start extrapolating to anyone with a degree as somehow part of this elite, because I'm like, that's just not true.
Yeah.
Like, and the other thing that's done, and I don't think Catherine, I say as if I know her personally, we're friends on Twitter, but I say, I don't think Catherine actually does this, but the Bellows people and the Compact people do, which is to bait and switch a projection of the working class, but seeing them as essentially inert. And that what is really going on here is more what Michael Lind describes as a professional class versus a petite bourgeois, with an overclass basically playing referee, and the kind of shock troops of politics being the working class and who they side with in any particular moment.
I mean, I really hate it. Just robs people of their agency,
right?
As actors,
But what's funny, Elijah, this is also the worldview of Adam Tooze and a lot of the progressive MMTer types too. Like, it's just one elite versus the another, and that's what's actually going. And like, working class or people of color, whoever are. I mean, this is, it's funny. In Ta-Nehisi Coates's like weird condemnation of Trumpism, but also like excoriating Bernie, he also says this explicitly. Like that, like, well, we trust someone like Hillary Clinton because we have the dirt on her. And I'm like, oh, so you view this as you're going to use one elite who you can control versus and shame versus another elite which you can't. So you view everyone as like basically just captive to this elite politics. And I think that's what Lasch's last book, the kind of what, for all my criticisms of Revolt of the Elite, that's what he's right about. And this problem is the elite, like even elites who will supposedly side with the working class or side with
they're doing it from their own for their own purposes,
right? Side with the black experience or whatever. Like Adolf Reed talks about this in terms of, or even like Trujillo talks about elite capture. And Trujillo pointed out, well, there's elite capture in working class politics. I'm like, goddamn, yeah, there is.
Yeah,
actually, I mean, it's not just identity politics where there's elite capture.
This is like my broad overview for my research topic. Is you can kind of read Lasch as a history of the long 20th century in a number of ways, and one of the ways is as a historian of liberalism for that period. Mm-hmm. And so it comes in with the formation of a new corporate elite, distinct from the regional elites of a prior era of American capitalism, that co-opt particular aspects of the new radicalism, of populism, and of progressivism to assert a viable ruling method, including a cultural wing in the family, in schools, in the university system, and an economic wing in what Lasch sees as an alliance between big business, unions, and the government, or not an alliance, but an accord between them, an understanding. And a lot of what he writes about is how that unraveled, and how particular aspects of that ate it alive, ate that accord alive. And Revolt of the Elites is in part a hint at what we're seeing in our world now, which is an attempt by the remnants of that old elite, plus new people who have been added in, to create a new accord and to create a way for liberalism to limp on. And elite co-option of working class politics is partially that. It's partially robbing working class politics of more radical options in an effort to stave off a coming collapse, in the same way that successfully occurred for a long period of time for American capitalism.
All right.
And I'm not sure if that's going to happen or not.
I'm not sure that if the AOC is going to get to be Nancy Pelosi.
No.
Though she's definitely become rich.
But this is their goal, their goal is to have a functional form of American liberalism, which includes most of the people we think of, a lot of the people we think of as conservatives, but possibly not all of them, because
I was about to say, I would, until Trump, this is a change after Trump.
Yeah.
Now, I think people who get all sanguine about the Bush days, I remember like Elizabeth Sandifer and I had me with my mouth falling out, and people thought it was shock, and it was more just I had no idea how to respond to this, of her defense of Bush. Like, Bush won't put us in the camps like Trumpists will. And I'm like, are you forgetting that Dick Cheney, whose daughter is a lesbian, was willing to explicitly flame anti-gay sentiment, to pass gay marriage bans, to help
in the 2004
elections? Have you forgotten this? They would throw people in a camp in a heartbeat.
Yeah. This is what I think is one thing you can take from Trump, is that a lot of these underlying negotiations, and I'm using negotiations not necessarily in a personal sense because I'm not in the room, but even occurred under like a lunatic who you don't want in control of your country, especially if you have a stake in the continuation of American capitalism. And you see this in stuff like the CARES Act, the various COVID bailouts, the format which the tax cut took, which is a mass infusion of money into the economy, which has continued under the Biden administration. and which is premised on, some reshoring, on letting that QE continue.
Until recently, then crushing the working class with its cost.
Yes. It's even somebody, especially Trump, because he had no interest in governing, could not. He was useful for making this transformation happen. And in the same way that people like think mistakenly, or like, oh, they're like the Green New Deal. It's if it was passed in its current form, it's just like all these leftist priorities and the trench coat of environmentalism or whatever, which is a very common conservative critique. That's what the CARES Act was. That's what the COVID bailouts were, is an accord of this kind in addressing a social problem with the purpose of reconceptualizing the in which economics would operate in society.
Like the CARES Act has all these giveaways to basically churches that let them survive COVID in the most corrupt ass PPP bailout way, like backdoor bailout way. There's all kinds of stuff.
Or selective bailouts for the airline industry or whatever.
Right.
Like my point is, and this is, I think, one thing Lasch gets really correct, is that every government has an interest in addressing what it sees as social problems, which can be problems for all of society, but could also be a problem for just the government. But the terms of how you address them is one expression of class rule, and one piece of evidence for who's in charge.
Right. For example, we're not addressing inflation by taxing the rich. Right?
Yeah.
Which is what Keynesianism, or even MMT, frankly, MMT says you don't have to tax the rich except during inflation.
What Ted Kennedy's platform in the 1980s, when there was also high inflation, was combine high interest rates with give handouts for the poor and large taxes on the rich.
Right.
Like there's multiple approaches one can take to addressing social problems. Why have we chosen this one? Because it's beneficial. Who's it beneficial for? The
elites and donor classes of both parties.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a break. This is a good point to end on a good positive vision last, because we both stated our disagreements. And I think lately there's been so many me stating my disagreements with Lasch that people forget that I'm fundamentally in agreement with him. Like there's stuff that I want to talk about on class culture stuff that I think is true, that I think the leftists are fundamentally uncomfortable with. One of the things that I would say, for example, that I'm going to talk about in our what will be a second episode for other people, will be the second half of our conversation for us, is that Lasch was essentially correct that the values and ways of talking that emerged in, quote, the ghetto, and by that he meant the inner city, and the lack of belief in the future would actually affect the cultural values of people who were far richer than that. And I can use liberal sociology to talk about how that's fundamentally true. And I think there's some other things that we kind of have to deal with. I also think the reason why the conservative backlash on trans issues has been so effective is that it speaks to people's fundamental uncomfortability with the decline of the family. That's also been expressed in incels and the contempt for incels. Now, I think incel culture is gross and problematic and bad, and every critique of it that exists is true. But one thing I will say is that it's involuntary. So these are people coming up with reactionary reasoning, ad hoc, post hoc reasoning for their situation, and conservatives, reactionaries, and whatnot of all types have seized in on that. If you don't speak to it at all, this is another point of Lasch, the only people who will speak to it are reactionaries. And Lasch makes this point over and over and over again when he's complaining about the Atari Democrats, who are like, you're just denying these social problems exist, where the right is speaking to them. They're lying about the answer, but they are speaking to them. whereas
Yeah,
you're just
I mean,
like, it's not a problem.
and this is one thing which I take away from him is it's vital that the left have a vision of culture, and I speak of culture very broadly in this sense, that is alternate to that of either the right or of liberalism, at least in some ways, because it's not working,
Yeah, I feel
and
like we on cultural stuff, even when we have economic critiques of liberalism or political critiques of liberalism, the cultural critique of most leftists is identical to the cultural critique of liberals.
yeah, and
And
it's like we just want government funding for the things that you say you support
right.
a lot of the time, which is a mistake because it's a whole realm of society which is worth critiquing and worth examining.
Right.
Even if you share an underlying commitment to certain values of a generalized tolerance, a generalized pluralism in some ways, free speech, whatever.
All right. I think that's a great place to end. We'll pick back up. We're going to talk about the PMC versus Lasch's views on class. We're going to go more into detail about the party of the id, the party of the ego, and the party of the superego, and whether or not that's still accurate. I go back and forth on this. Actually, I think it's super useful, but I'm also like, I don't know that it applies. Like when I'm trying to figure out who's the party of the id today, is it the Democrats or the Republicans? I'm like, which id?
It's everybody's the party of the id.
Now it's like they won. It's like
it's a party, and there's room for you. Right?
Yeah, it's the party of the id, and then sometimes it's a party of the superego against the id that we don't like, but like there's no ego party at all.
Either ego ideal or rational ego.
Right.
But anyway, we'll go into this.
Yeah, we'll go into all this in more detail. We'll talk about the Lasch's differences between with the current theories of the PMC, and I think we're going to mostly focus on the ways in which Lasch is right now because we've spent 2 hours complicating and muddying it. I think we need to, for people to appreciate that we understand some of the problems, but to still speak on it. Like Daniel Tutt and I did this too. Daniel talks about when Lasch writes about women, even more than say Lacan or other Freudians, he literalizes stuff that you probably shouldn't literalize.
I mean, you can't take Freud too literally because Moses to monotheism is heretical. I would remind people.
Yeah,
I'm joking, but it is.
Well, it is. It's also wrong. It's like I love Moses and monotheism as speculative anthropology, but I'm also like, but we know it's wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's to say actually the same is true with like Nietzsche's. I'm not as I'm more ambivalent about Nietzsche, but Nietzsche's speculative genealogy of morals,
like completely
about Jews.
False, but
it's like it takes actually Jews. There's like the Jewish history of itself.
I mean, it's like
way too seriously.
It's like I'd love to be as powerful as Nietzsche assumes, but let's not forget that the last 2 Jews in Afghanistan under Taliban rule were expelled from prison because they argued with one another too much.
Yeah. So we'll come back and talk about that. So let's roll out.